Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Today, it is my great pleasure to talk to Terry Anderson. He is the founder of the Property and Environmental Research Center, which is a think tank in Bozeman, Montana, that focuses on market solutions to environmental problems. That's what we're going to be talking about today. He is an original thinker whose research helped launch the idea of free market environmentalism. And we have him to thank for the fact that now there's an actual debate over the proper role of government in managing natural resources. Welcome.
Oh, great to be with you. Thanks, Juliet.
You're also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, right?
That's right. I spend 3 months of the year at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Since I live in Montana, it's wonderful to get out of here in the spring when the snow keeps coming and you wish it would stop. So March, April, and May, you can find me in Palo Alto, California.
That's cool. Okay, so before I start, I want to ask you a question that I ask all my guests, which is, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
I think perhaps the most important thing is that this generation understands that my generation is leaving you with a huge debt burden, and that means that the government is somehow have to grow in power and take over more of your life, be it Social Security, Medicare, or $3 billion bailouts. All of these add to a debt that your generation is going to bear the burden of.
That's a really good response. I think it's really true. Like a lot of people in my generation that I've been talking to, they want the government to step in and help with this or help with that, but they don't understand the trade-offs necessarily of what that means. So they want the government to have a bigger control on their life, but they don't understand the consequences of that, and they haven't experienced it, so they don't really understand it, which I don't know. I can just think about it and not want that, but okay.
Well, this
So
has been your generation, if we can keep using that, has lived through incredible prosperity, and it seems as though with such prosperity that nothing is out of reach. So bailing out an economy doesn't seem out of reach until one asks who pays for that. And we've debated first a $3 trillion bailout, and that passed, and debated a second $3 trillion, and you just can't keep getting more without somehow paying for it.
it's just, I don't know. I feel like it's almost as though people aren't thinking about who's going to pay for it in the end, and it's kind of frustrating because to me, at least, I look at something like that and I'm like, well, it's obvious. You're either going to pay for it now or whoever is paying in the future, whatever taxpayers there are in the future, they're all going to pay for it. And it's like, why would you want to put that burden on future generations, on your kids? Like, it's like, is that really necessary? I don't know. But okay. So jumping in, as I mentioned, you're famous for endorsing free market environmentalism, which is a concept that to a lot of people sounds kind of like an oxymoron. So what is free market environmentalism, and what advantages does it have over conventional environmentalism? And also, have you always been a free market environmentalist?
Oh, great set of questions. Let me first back up and just say I was one of the people who helped found PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center, not the founder. So There are other people who get some credit here, and while I hope I've been a leading thinker, other people have participated in creating this paradigm, if you will. Uh, so, what is free market environmentalism? Free market environmentalism is a paradigm that suggests how we create positive incentives for people to be stewards of natural resources, generally the environment in a larger context. And those incentives are a combination of two things. The first is secure, clear, and secure property rights to resources, which then leads to the second thing, market exchanges that back to our earlier discussion tell us what the price is of stewardship of environmental quality. And I think it when we first started talking about free market environmentalism, and in fact, when I co-authored the first edition of the book with that title with Don Leal, one of the reviewers said that free market environmentalism is an oxymoron, and then quipped, and the authors are the moron part. I think it illustrates the extent to which it seemed like a silly idea in 1992. Since then, it has come to be much more accepted amongst the kind of green of green environmentalists, not because they have discovered, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations or somehow had an epiphany about the efficacy of markets, but because there have been many places where markets have demonstrated as a been demonstrated as a better way of improving environmental quality and resource stewardship. And so I don't forget the last question you asked. Have I always been an environmentalist? I grew up in Montana. I've lived in Montana my adult life, and as I said to one person who said, "Do you really believe in this?" I said, "I believe in it because I care about the environment. I live here because I care about the environment, and I believe there are better ways to achieve the ends that I want." So yes, I've always been an environmentalist, but I've also been a pragmatist, and as a freedom lover, I think that there are better ways to achieve the kind of environmental quality that I would like.
So, I want to unpack what this all means. How should we think about environmental policy and what role should markets play in protecting the environment?
For starters, let me use a line I used as a a chapter title in a book I co-authored, and that is "No One Washes a Rental Car." And when you think about that, it really kind of captures what happens if no one owns the air, owns the water, owns the land. There's no incentive to be a steward of any of those things. And so once I was giving a speech and to some students, and I said, "No one washes a rental car," and one of the students said, "You that's not correct." And then I said, "Okay, well, who does?" And he said, "Hertz washes rental cars." uh, or now I guess Avis or Enterprise or whoever you want to put in there. Uh, and the point that he was making, and that I think is so appropriate, is no one washes a rental car unless you own the rental car. And therefore, the way to think about the environment is to ask, why would people destroy something that's valuable, or not, if not destroy, not take care of something that's valuable? And the answer is, if they don't own it, they have no incentive to take care of it. And I think you take any environmental issue, take uh, land use. Am I going to care for the forest behind my house if I don't own the forest behind my house? The answer is no. If I own the forest, which I do own some of, I am going to be a steward of that. I like a rental car company. I will wash the car. And it's not easy to find ways to create ownership, but when we can, it's that ownership that encourages stewardship.
That's that's a really good comparison, the rental car to the environment. I don't know. I've never really thought of it like that, but it makes so much sense. And I feel like if you back it with the right incentives, like ownership, then people will follow through. They will care for it because it's theirs.
Well, another way to think of it is, do you ever scratch graffiti on your bathroom wall?
No.
Probably not. And probably you don't scratch it on the bathroom wall of the restaurant you go into. But we see more graffiti on public bathroom walls than we do on private bathroom walls. And it's, again, there is a steward of the private ones.
That is also a very good way to think about it. I never really, I mean, also even thinking about where I see graffiti, it's never on well, almost never on private property, which is crazy. And then I don't know, I never made that connection. And then also further comparison to the environment. That's just it's a very good way of thinking about it.
Well, in fact, let's push that just a little farther because the graffiti point is a good one. You do see it on box cars in train box cars, and those are privately owned. And it raises the question of, can you enforce your right to a boxcar? And when the boxcar is sitting on a dark siding in a rail yard, it's harder to enforce your property claim on the side of that. And similarly, uh, if I can't keep people from trespassing onto my property, uh, because there's no way to see them, or because the law won't allow me to enforce it, then even if I have some claim to it, I won't necessarily take such good care of
Wow. You really stretched that, but it really worked. Like it makes sense. It's I don't know. I think it's a really good point. I don't know. I've never thought of it in this way, but everything you've said really just makes a lot of sense and kind of I feel like that's a way to get to people is talking about stuff they understand or stuff that they've thought about, stuff they can relate to. Like graffiti, you see graffiti in a lot of places, but do you see it in restaurants? No.
Let me, sorry if I keep
No, you're
pushing
fine.
this, but I think it just illustrates these points so well. Well, everybody might not be quite as familiar with trout fishing as I am because I love doing it. Uh, if I go onto a stream that's on private property, what I find is it's probably pretty well managed. It's not crowded. They may tell you, don't keep fish, release them after you hook them and catch them. Uh, and they charge a fee for all that. And they with because of the fee, they have an incentive to keep the quality of that trout fishing experience up. On the other hand, if I can access a stream because there's a public access point, I will find lots of cars there. I will find that it's overfished. Either there aren't as many fish, or the fish have seen every lure and fly known to mankind, and they're hard to catch. And so there's what we call the tragedy of the commons. Uh, Lots of people out there overusing the resource, and it that doesn't happen if the resource is privately owned and there's someone who hasn't gained something from being the good steward.
I was actually about to ask about Tragedy of the Commons. Um, good segue there. I found the following definition of it online for those who don't know, which is, quote, "The tragedy of the commons is a situation in a shared resource system where individual users, acting independently according to their own self-interest, behave contrary to the common good of all users by depleting or spoiling the shared resource through their collective action," end quote. which in examples I see a lot with the ocean and things like that, with fish as a concrete example of it. So, what are some examples of it in the United States that you've seen, and what are other ways to prevent it in environmental policy?
Uh, well, let me give you an example I saw 2 days ago, or when I drove along a very famous fishing river here in Montana, the Madison River. It's a blue ribbon trout stream. People come from all over the world to fish there. Uh, and when you drive along that, and it used to be when there weren't as many people fishing and flights were more expensive and we weren't as wealthy, uh, there weren't too many people using that stream. In the last 10 years, the number of people fishing, the number of people coming to Montana to fish the Madison has grown exponentially. As a result of that, more and more boats are floating down this river. I call it bumper boats. Uh, and and now there's controversy. Should we limit the number of people? It's not the same experience, to say nothing of the fact that the fish again have seen every fly and lure. So it's not the same experience, and so the local people say, well, we should keep the people, the out of staters, out, and the guides who help the out of state people float down the river say, no, it's there are too many local people floating. It's a classic example of the tragedy of the commons. Lots of people coming to something where there's no limit on what they can do. It's overfishing the river. The size of fish has gotten smaller. The number of catches has gone down, and you have the bumper boat problem. And the question becomes then, how do you solve this? Uh, well, one answer, the simple free market environmental answer, would be privatize the river. Well, realistically, that's not going to happen. It's a large river, it flows through many pieces of private property. And so the question becomes, is there uh, any way that we can limit access? What are the ways we can limit access? As I said, if you just say, well, let's reduce the number of boats, it's whose boat? One solution, and I'll switch to the ocean fisheries, is to create a property right in a share of the uh, sustainable use of that resource. Now, that's a sustainable is a kind of wishy-washy, squishy word, but in the case of fisheries, you can actually calculate the total catch that's sustainable, and then you can allocate an annual share in that catch. And with the Madison River, you could say, well, we think the sustainable number of boats. You could have, the Fish and Wildlife Department determine this is X, and we're going to allocate X to these people, and then let them trade X. If they don't want to fish that day, let them sell the fishing right for that day to someone else. That would create a market. And if you're not going to do that, then at least we should think about establishing prices for access to that river. That won't be perfect because it'll be a government set price, not a market price, but at least will help allocate or overcome the tragedy of the commons.
So, I mean, at least from the example and from what I've seen of tragedy of the commons, it seems to be a type of world or a type of situation where everything is free and there are no trade-offs that people have to make. Like to go fish in that river, no one has to pay, at least right now, other than for a plane ticket to get there. Is that the right way to be thinking about it?
Oh, definitely. There's no price. There's no penalty if you add to the crowding. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways to manage the commons short of pure property rights. I start with a family. Most of us live in families where we have a refrigerator and we put food in it. And okay, maybe the adults in the family do the work and put the food in there, and the kids get to share it. But we don't have a shelf that belongs to Juliet, and one that belongs to Terry, and one that belongs to Monica. We allocate that as a family, and we kind of have expectations of one another. That can work in small groups. But when you get to something like the open ocean or even the Madison River, the small group won't behave as if there is some cost. If I take the last Coca Cola out of the refrigerator, I know that that means my wife can't have it. And while I might be selfish enough to still take it, I probably am going to say, "Would you like half of the Coke?" Uh, so again, you can solve the tragedy of the commons in small groups because, as you put it, there's a cost to behaving badly. But in large groups, that cost disappears as we don't have face-to-face transactions. And markets make us aware of those costs because we have to pay a price.
What role does the government play in a free market system, especially in environmental policy?
Well, the most important role for government in any kind of policy, and certainly for environmental policy, is to help individuals define and enforce property rights. If Let me go the opposite direction and keep using the fishing comparison. In Montana, we had private property rights to the bed and banks of rivers. And those private property rights meant that I can't just step out into any river and fish anytime, any place I like. It meant there was less crowding. Some landowners just said, "I don't want you on my property." Some said, "I'll let you on if you ask permission." Some said, "I'll let you on if you pay a fee." Uh, Montana changed the rules. So it went from defining and enforcing property rights to saying, we're not going to enforce those property rights. In fact, you can have access to any stream as long as you get on at a public point, for example, a bridge. That's gone the opposite direction. The government didn't define and enforce property rights. It actually took property rights away from individuals and created a tragedy of the commons, the Madison River example. Uh, so the role of government is to enforce property rights that people uh, create themselves by and large, but courts create property rights when you and I are battling over whether my tree branch hangs over your driveway. Uh, it's a question of, do I get to have a tree, or do you, with branches over your driveway, or do you get a branch free driveway? And we might go to court over that. And the court says, Juliet has a right to a branch free driveway. Now we have a property right. If I really care about my branches, I can pay you some fee and we can have an exchange. The government's role is to establish a rule of law, court systems that allow people to define and enforce property rights, and then police are part of the enforcement. Although I have locks on my house as part of my enforcement too, but the government should define and enforce property rights wherever possible.
Can you give us an example of an instance where free market environmentalism has led to a better solution than government regulation?
Uh, there are plenty of examples. Let me think of probably. Well, I guess I would start with the one that I've probably written more about than anything else, and that is water and water rights. If water is free and you pay nothing for it, then you'll just turn on the spigot and let it run till it's cold, and leave it running while you brush your teeth, and you have no incentive to conserve water. In places where there are property rights to water, and here in the American West, those property rights are well defined. They are based on what's called prior appropriation. The first people who came and used the water got a right to a claim of a river, let's say. Once the farmer, and most of these went to farmers because they were the first people here. Uh, but now the city is saying, well, geez, we need more water. The market is resolving that quite nicely. The city goes to farmers and says, we need more water because the city is growing. The farmer says, well, I grow uh, alfalfa or I grow wheat and it's worth so much. Will you pay me more? And when the city offers more, the farmer says, I'll find other ways or other crops, or maybe even quit farming. But that's a way, and it's all over the West, has been the way that water allocation has been resolved through water markets, and it's just a classic example. But let me give you here's yet another that captures it in a very different kind of context. They in 19 I can't even remember, about 1985 or 1990, the federal government decided that wolves, which had been exterminated in Yellowstone, should be reintroduced. And so they captured some wolves in Canada. They flew them down, they put them into a pen, they fed them for a while, and turned them loose in Yellowstone Park. The ranchers around the park said, wait a minute, this sounds like a bad deal for us because those wolves may come out and eat our cattle or our sheep. An environmental group simply said, look, we know why you'd oppose it. We'll pay you if wolves eat your cattle or sheep. The environmental group raised money by getting its members to buy posters that said save the wolf, and spent the money to pay off the ranchers if they lost cattle or sheep. All of a sudden, the ranchers were, oh, this isn't such a bad deal. We're willing to tolerate a few wolves since we don't bear the cost. So it was a win-win situation. The wolf lovers got wolves. The cattle ranchers didn't have to pay to feed the wolves with their cattle and sheep, and everybody was better off.
That's so cool. I love hearing about examples of this sort of stuff. I don't know. It's just very interesting. So kind of moving in a different direction but on the same track, I guess. What is the single biggest myth that people have about the environment and its health and how to improve it?
Well, first, the I don't know if it's the biggest, but I think the first myth that needs to be dispelled is that the environment is getting worse. It's not getting worse. Air quality, water quality, land use, all these have been improving, especially in countries that have a rule of law and property rights. And what comes along with the rule of law and property rights is increased wealth. When we're wealthier, then we can afford to take better care of the environment. If you are living in a village in Africa and you barely have enough to eat, and an impala walks by, you don't say, oh, I think I'll save that impala. I think rather I'll shoot that impala and eat it. And once you have a full belly and a roof over your head and some health care and a car and those kinds of things, you start saying, I think we'll just save wildlife. And this is that applies so well to elephants. Elephants are, are are not cared for because poor people have no incentive to care for them, and we rich people can say save the elephant. Uh, but back to the point, and that is that uh, wealthier is healthier for the environment, and across the world, growing countries that are more prosperous have cleaner environments. So I think the first myth to be dispelled is the environment's getting worse. We have more trees in the United States today than we had 250 years ago. So across the world, forest cover has been growing, not declining. Species, this notion that we're losing species at astronomical rates is just wrong. It's flat wrong. It's not correct. We're not losing species. In fact, there are more and more species that are being saved. So that's probably the biggest myth that exists that I think needs to be dispelled. Maybe the second one is the kind of tragedy of populations commons. That is, Paul Ehrlich is a famous uh, uh, population scientist. I don't really remember his field. And he wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And in it, he predicted that we would have famine and pestilence he wrote this book in the 1970s, that by the end of the century we would have famine and pestilence. Yet the world is well fed. We have far less famine than we ever had, And he kept saying, oh, well, we'll have too many people. The earth can only support so many. The fact of the matter is, the earth supports more and more, and it keeps supporting more and more because we become more and more productive, given that we have private property rights.
When people say that if we let the market be in charge of the environment, that we'd have more pollution, we wouldn't have clean water, and that corporation would own all the land and we'd have no access to the parks. What do you say to that? What's your response?
Well, I'll start with the easiest of those, access to parks. Uh, as it is now, if you go to, at least if we're talking about national parks, it isn't the poor people who go there. It's the middle class and wealthy people who go there. So, but it is the overall population that pays for these. And it's not the case that if they were private parks that somehow people wouldn't be able to get in. I know of some really really famous private parks that people got into: Disneyland, Disney World, Six Flags. Now, they aren't necessarily national parks or natural parks, but there are natural places all over the world that have been preserved by private ownership. And it isn't only then restricted to, the Rockefellers or uh, the the Gateses who get to go there. So, in the case of parks, it's just not the case that somehow only the rich will go there. Uh, uh, to the cases of clean air and clean water, uh, there's no, as long as I can. Let me start over. The case of those, the issue is, how will we dispose of the waste created in the production process? So that's when I taught a course at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. I used to say businesses buy things to produce their products, and so they bring them in the back door and they pay for them, and then they turn them into products that they can sell. And in the process, some of the stuff they bring in doesn't end up being in the product, that it isn't something that it's the waste, it's left over. So if you're cutting up a board, you have some sawdust. And as long as you can dispose of that sawdust into the common air by burning it, then there is no market. And the question becomes: is there a way to create property rights to air or water that will encourage people to be uh, uh, to put fewer emissions into it? And one way to do that is and here again, the government has a role. You can limit the use of the air. You can say you can only put in so much stuff. And we did this with the Clean Air Act when we limited the amount of sulfur that could be put into the air from coal-fired generating plants. And we virtually eliminated the problem of acid rain by saying there's a limit to how much you can put in. You can trade the quota you have to put it in. If somebody wants to pay you to not put it in, they can do so. And environmental groups bought the emission rights of companies that were putting SO2 into the air. But again, it's creating a kind of property right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good response. I think that's very, I don't know, it's very direct and it makes sense as a response. And I don't think there would be any environmentalist that'd be like, no, that wouldn't work because it it works. It sounds like it would work. So turning to the Endangered Species Act, it became a law in the United States in 1973, and its purpose was to protect endangered species. So, how has it worked out, and what are some of the unintended consequences of this act?
Well, it's worked out quite well for the bald eagle. The bald eagle was, at the time the act was passed, was on the decline. It was attributed to pesticides. It probably wasn't pesticides totally, but nonetheless, they were on the decline. And so the law said you can't take a species. and that meant you couldn't shoot a bald eagle and you couldn't poison bald eagles. And so, as a result of that, the population of bald eagles was protected, and now almost any state in the union, you see bald eagles from time to time, and then where I live, you see them all the time. So there was some good things to come out of the Endangered Species Act in that way. That said, uh, the the notion of take has been expanded and expanded to mean you can't even do anything to what could be habitat for an endangered species. And so the red-cockaded woodpecker is the most studied example. It's a species in the southeastern United States. It was listed in the early days of the Endangered Species Act. Over time, the federal government, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, started to say, well, it's not just shooting those woodpeckers; it's cutting down trees they would live in. And what happened as a result was, before the birds moved into the trees, people would cut them so that they weren't an attraction for the birds. That worked counter to what the Endangered Species Act was designed to do. It meant that we were losing habitat because we were saying to people, if you have habitat, you can't use those trees, you can't do anything to manage it. And today we do it with water. Under the Obama administration, a ruling called the Waters of the United States, WATAS, said that the federal government controls every trickle of water everywhere in the United States. And ranchers and farmers started saying, wait, if you're going to regulate my land because I have federal government water on it, I'm going to change my use of the land in ways that may not be good for species, uh, that depend on water. So, uh, if you make it costly for people to provide environmental quality, in this case endangered species, and you don't reward them for doing so, you can expect to have less of them.
At PERC, you and your team work on alternatives to the Endangered Species Act, and you've laid out many solutions, some government solutions and some private solutions. Can you tell us about a few of them?
Yeah, I mean the most important uh, private solution is to have private groups pay for habitat. If you are a yellow-bellied, blue-footed warbler lover and you want habitat for them, get together with all of your yellow-bellied, blue-footed warbler lovers and pay me, and I'll provide warbler habitat. And we've and that's happened. The Nature Conservancy, one of the largest of the environmental groups, purchased a ranch in Montana where grizzly bears would come down out of the high country in the spring and forage on grass and young cattle, calves. When the Nature Conservancy purchased the ranch, they said, we're not going to have any cattle on the ranch during the time the grizzly bears are there. And now the grizzly bears come down, there's no conflict. When the grizzly bears go back to the high country, the Nature Conservancy brings cows in and grazes the ranch and makes money off of that. That's a private solution to providing habitat for an endangered species. And it's again one that's been very effective. In other cases, uh, like the reintroduction of the wolf, uh, it was Defenders of Wildlife came in and said, we will pay for wolf predation. The wolf is an endangered species. The government reintroduced it in Yellowstone, but private groups have encouraged ranchers uh, to uh, to tolerate wolves. Now the National Wildlife Federation and different group actually pays ranchers to move their cattle off of land when it's more likely that there will be wolves and grizzly bears there. It's simply taking away the conflict, and it is a private, and all of that's been done with private money, not public money. wolf lovers, grizzly bear lovers, and yellow-bellied, blue-footed warbler lovers can do a lot to save species.
And what about government solutions?
Well, as I said, I think that there are regulations that may be necessary, as the take clause in the Endangered Species Act is an example. Regulations that say you can't shoot bald eagles, and that we weren't bald eagles aren't a food source. They are the national bird, this the symbol on the presidential seal, etc. And so simply saying you can't shoot them is a regulation that's maybe not unlike saying you can't drive your car down the left side of the road. We need those kinds of rules to constrain action when we can't have private ownership. Uh, if it's a private road, we could say, you can drive on the left side and the other people drive on the right side instead of the way we do it. So, but it's hard to know how we could own eagles, and so the government can regulate and did and has been successful to the point where we've downlisted the eagle, so it's no longer an endangered species.
So, finally, I want to ask you, what is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Whoa, that's a really tough one. Uh, well, I suppose to take a recent one, I think there are probably some things in my younger life. Uh, in fact, I wasn't always such a libertarian. At a younger time in my life, felt government had a bigger role to play, but the more I've seen that government solutions don't work well, that the less enamored I've become with them. But let me take a concrete one of recent times. I would have been a global warming denier in the early days of the debate. Come on, show me the evidence. As the globe, is it really warming? And many scientists argued and debated this, and people like myself, not a climate scientist, said, I'm siding with the people that say it's not warming. I no longer think that. I think that we are getting warmer temperatures, and as a result of that, there are changes that are occurring. Some places there's more rainfall, some places there's less, and in some places there's more snowfall and less, and so on. Uh, so I've changed my position from denying global warming to accepting that it's happening. But I haven't changed my position on what role there is for government. What the government is doing is not really solving the problem at all. And what is the most hopeful way to solve the problem is what has solved every problem in human history, and that is human ingenuity. People will adapt to climate change. They will stop building houses next to the seashore, provided they aren't given subsidized insurance when hurricanes or floods occurs. And we do that all the time, and it distorts our incentive to adapt. But if people face the reality of global warming, they will adapt. They will move to higher ground. They will plant crops in different places. They'll plant different kinds of crops, and the list goes on and on. So I've changed my position from being a denier to accepting global warming, but I haven't changed my position on the role of government.
That's really interesting. Really quick, what made you change your mind?
Data made me change my mind. I think that over time the data have become much clearer that temperatures are rising. That said, the data are not clear on frequency, or they are actually frequency of hurricanes. One of the examples that the climate change people have pointed to. We have more. We don't have more hurricanes. We actually have less, and and they hit coastal areas where we built them up. Miami, for example. So yeah, there's more property damage from hurricanes, but it's because we have more property. But the data on climate, on temperature, I think, are now quite clear that in general temperatures have risen.
And I think the data showing that what the government's impact on this issue is also kind of clear. I mean,
Oh, I
s
mean, we build flood control. Take New Orleans, for example. We build flood control infrastructure that doesn't work. And when people do get hit by hurricanes, we say, oh, move back in and we'll protect you next time, or we'll give you insurance. And does just what we don't want to do if indeed hurricanes are having a bigger effect on people's life.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Thank you so much. This has been such an interesting podcast, and I definitely need to look more into this issue because it it's very your take on it is very different from what a lot of well-meaning people say and how they think we should deal with this stuff, and it's also very different from anything I've really looked into. So, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.